So we're going to be talking about the lack of problem in randomized clinical trials.
This is brought to you by the Men in the Yellow Hat,
This is our TNA, and I'm Ishan.
and I'm Raphael. Of Mice and Not Men, Samuel Hellman and Deborah Hellman argue that randomized trials often place physicians in ethically intolerable positions of choosing between the good of the patient and that of society.
Randomized clinical trials require doctors to simultaneously act as physicians and as scientists.
The role of a scientist is not therapy, but ensuring that the trial is conducted so that everyone can benefit.
While the role of a doctor should be to act solely for the good of the patient.
The good of society in the doctor's role should not even be considered. Debunking a utilitarian approach, Hellman states that if experiments on humans were done under the Nazi regime, everyone would agree that these measures are immoral and extreme, even though there was social gain.
No social gain would justify any experiment that violates such fundamental rights.
This further proves that utilitarian approach is one that cannot be used by a physician because he or she needs to place the patient's good over any social gain.
Although this is exaggerated, to consider utilitarian gain from randomized clinical trials is consistent neither with the physician's role nor with the patient's right.
The problem with randomized clinical trials. By debunking a utilitarian approach, the authors argue that physicians should not embrace the roles that value social gain.
As a result, they should inform a patient whether a particular treatment is working.
The patient might leave the trial since it's not helping them, which means that the trial will no longer be able to work.
As a result, we can see that the problem with randomized clinical trials is that physicians are ethically obligated to inform the patient, which jeopardizes the trial.
The doctor and patient relationship is one that we critically need to understand. A possible solution to this problem is that the patient signs away his or her rights when consenting to the trial.
If this is the case, then a physician informing a treatment is not working is violating the patient's consent.
This is paternalism, which is defined by the doctor using coercion or deception in order to act in the best interest of the patient without the consent of the patient.
In randomized clinical trials, the coercion would be the doctor informing a patient that a treatment is not working because the patient has consented not to be told this information.
However, the authors insist that the patient cannot use his or her autonomy to waive the right of being entitled to the best judgment of care of the doctor. This right is inalienable.
However, we can see in other examples that this right is not actually inalienable. Patients can refuse this entitlement. For example, a patient can refuse life-saving treatment as long as they have autonomy. For example, patients have a right to refuse treatment.
Hellman later on argues the trials for terminally ill patients, saying that they can't give consent because they might feel a type of coercion when a doctor talks to him or her about the trial.
The patient might not want to damage their relationship with the doctor by deciding not to follow what the doctor suggests.
A solution to this problem is that hospital magazines could be placed showing regulated ads that were made by the scientist so that the patients can read. This changes the role of a doctor pretty much by allowing the patient to exercise his or her autonomy in order to consent to the trial.
Patients can also give consent to be in trials before they get terminally ill. They can give consent before they get a diagnosis of whether they have this condition. So then they would still retain their autonomy. This happens by becoming an organ donor. You can give consent to have your organs given away, donated when you are dead.
We would like to thank you, Dr. Fries, for everything. I believe as freshmen, this was a great introductory class. There was great social gain from your lessons, but also we learned a lot about medicine and pretty much ethics. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fries, for this course.